Welcome to the Climate Conscious podcast, where we discuss all things sustainable. I am your host, Bazi, and this week's special guest is Dr. Devon Garner. Hi, Dr. Gardner.
Hi there, Val.
Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Dr. Devon Garner is the Program Manager for Energy and Head of the Energy Unit at the CARICOM Secretariat. He holds a PhD in Physical Chemistry from the University of the West Indies, Muna. Dr. Gardner is a trained climate change specialist whose extensive experience includes resource assessment, engineering design, policy development, and capacity building for low-carbon projects. So, Dr. Gardner, we can all acknowledge the importance of energy in our daily lives. When we flip a light switch, when we start the ignition in our vehicles, when we cook a meal for our family, particularly conventional sources of energy like oil and gas. They strongly affect economic activity as well as global geopolitics. These conventional energy systems also place a heavy burden on the environment. So, as head of the CARICOM Energy Unit, you have been given the mandate to advance the region's sustainable energy transition. Why is it necessary to transform the region's energy systems?
Certainly, you are right and spot on when you mentioned that energy is central to every single thing that we do in our daily lives. And as a result of that, we are oftentimes not aware of how much energy plays a role until it starts to either hurt us in terms of the price or if it's absent because of a supply disruption. It's like a watch, it always works, and it's not noticed when it works well, but when it stops working, then immediately you notice. Certainly, within the context of the Caribbean and sustainable energy, we are small island developing states as far as our classifications are. What that means is that many of the countries have very small landmass, and in instances where there are some of those which are low-lying states, also classified as small island developing states, such as Guyana, Belize, Suriname, which are considered part of the CARICOM region, which is the Caribbean community. Those countries, although they are extensive land masses, they are very small populations, and what these small populations, in a sense, do is create these micro-islanded societies, even within those mega land masses. So you can imagine that these pockets of populations exist surrounded by huge tracts of land that are almost cut off from other populations elsewhere. So they are islanded in that sense. Okay. So not all islands in the Caribbean are surrounded by water, some are surrounded by jungle. That comes with inherent challenges. In many instances, some of our countries are not necessarily oil and gas producers. There are only a few that have been lucky enough, fortunate enough, blessed enough, as some would say, to have found or are in the process of developing our exploring and monetizing conventional fossil fuel resources that they have within their shores. Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and to a lesser extent Suriname, and some might say Barbados are the ones which do some amount of production now. Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana are the only two at this point in time that could be considered to have a surplus. Suriname is not yet at the point of surplus, but is headed there. So what that means is that we have countries that are pretty much very small, so therefore by them being small, their economies are also small because there's a limit to what they can produce economically. And so what that results in is constraints on their means of production. And so the importation of energy to run the systems in these countries is something that to a large extent has been a challenge because of the fact that oil and gas supplies, especially oil, we have had oil economies in most of the countries. Mm-hmm. And the oil supplies since 1973, when the first, if you want to call it, oil crisis came about, has been increasingly becoming more volatile. So oil markets are not your typical commodities market. They are affected a lot by commodities and cartelization because of the nature of oil being located in very specific pockets in the world where they can be interrupted and strategically manipulated. So you don't necessarily get the best value for money spent on oil. So countries are spending a lot of money to import oil oftentimes. I mean, now it's cheap, cheaper than usual. But oftentimes it's not cheap, and we are spending a lot of money importing this commodity, which is not necessarily priced in accordance with its value. And from that, we are now trying to extract value to develop our economies, and oftentimes the value that we are able to extract from it, commensurate with the price we are paying, is not necessarily the best aligned in respect to being able to give us the maximum benefit as far as is possible, to try and keep much of that foreign exchange that we would have used otherwise for oil imports, because, as I said, many of the countries are importing oil from outside or to use to run their economies. If we can keep a lot of that foreign exchange internally and use indigenous sources of energy, then of course that will improve quite a number of economics in the countries, including things like the foreign exchange reserves and so on. You know, you're talking about countries needing to compete globally with other countries, so in many sectors, tourism, agriculture, etc. And when your cost of input, for instance, into a sector, as we do in the Caribbean, is sometimes an order of magnitude higher than the cost of input, as it would be in North America or some of the other countries. Your energy cost of input is an order of magnitude higher.
Yeah, you just can't compete.
Exactly, it makes you not competitive at all, and that limits how much you can earn on the one hand, and it also reduces the amount of customers you will be able to attract and all of these things, and it means you have to spend more money to attract tourists to come to your country because your costs are higher. And yes, we do have sun and sea and the nice things which you try to advertise to attract the tourists, but at the end of the day, tourists still do care about the bottom line, the transportation and all of those things, in the taxes and all of those kind of things. Also, how much disposable income our own citizens will have, when they are paying significant amounts of money for electricity and transport, gasoline and other types of transport fuels to do their daily business. It means their disposable income, which they can spend within the economy and recirculate within the economy to drive the economy, is really being affected. It's a critical issue that is affecting Caribbean countries to meet their own economic development goals on the one hand. Then, of course, there's on the other side, yes, there are the environmental pieces, both local and global climate environment pieces. So there's the local pollutants which affect the quality of life of citizens who live in cities, based on a number of studies that we have seen done within the region. There are public health concerns that significant respiratory illnesses do occur because of the amount of smog and the amount of pollutants, particulate matters, and sulfur oxides and nitrous oxides that you have because of emissions that come from fossil fuel engines and, of course, power plants. But the larger piece, as we always say, climate change is really the dark side of fossil fuels, in the sense that the big global issue is what fossil fuels is doing to climate. You take something which is a hydrocarbon, which is what fossil fuels typically are, and you burn them, you are producing carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas. Of course, is going to act in such a way as to trap heat within the atmosphere, additional heat within the atmosphere that you would have through the normal atmospheric processes that would have ensued otherwise. And so what you get is this artificial warming close to the surface of the earth, and what that does, it warms the surface temperatures of the sea, right? Changes the surface temperature of the land, changes, and that has significant numbers of impact both on the terrestrial environment and the marine environment. Can create things like sea level rise. Of course, there's a temperature increase. There is already evidence that the Caribbean has been warmed about close to 1 degree Celsius since pre-industrial times, since the 1950s. There's sea level rise. There's evidence that there's some amount of sea level rise already within the Caribbean. About 30 millimeters of sea level rise has been recorded by climate specialists within the Caribbean. So there's sea level rise, which is another issue. There is also the issue of meteorological events like hurricanes and storms, which we know based on the science, based on the physics behind hurricanes and storms and so on, and floods and droughts. We know that this is affected by temperature. So therefore, any temperature change, these things, because they're so temperature sensitive, they naturally they're becoming more intense because of the kind of temperatures which are creating pressure systems that made them much more intense than they were before. These are some of the things you have. Biodiversity changes, coral reefs are bleaching. because CO2 is dissolving in the water, in the oceans, and causing it to become more acidic and those kind of things. Ultimately, our economies are being affected again by that because, as we said, no, the Caribbean is dependent heavily on tourism and agriculture, which are some of the most climate sensitive
industries. Yes.
So when you think about tourism, people coming to go to beaches. If you're talking about sea level rise, you have beach erosion there before occurring. People coming to dive in there, coming to look at the nice coral reefs and to see the fishes. And if the coral reefs have been bleached and are dying, then it certainly is going to affect your tourism. And then you're talking about agriculture. Some people refer to it as a vicious cycle, where your economic activities on which you depend are being eroded by climate change. What is going on with the global climate situation. And so that is already reducing your capability to earn revenue, not earning enough money, and oftentimes you are spending more money to keep your economy going. So it's a vicious cycle, we would say, and that naturally will affect your social dynamics. It's going to affect what you can spend on healthcare and education and all the social services. So then naturally it's not a recipe for sustainable development. So this is really a critical issue. And although the Caribbean itself may say, well, we are not the ones who produce a lot of the fossil fuels. The truth is, this is a global phenomenon. Carbon dioxide does not stay in one place. It travels across the entire globe. So therefore, at the end of the day, regardless of the source, all countries will be affected. But more so, as the scientists have shown, the Caribbean and the small island developing states, especially those within the Caribbean, are the ones which are most vulnerable due to all these things being, if you want to call it, perfectly aligned for the Caribbean to be maximally impacted in a negative way. So when you think about hurricanes, a hurricane, for instance, like Ivan in 2004 in Grenada, gets rid of 200% of the GDP. A superstorm like Sandy or hurricane of Sandy up in New York, New Jersey in the US in the mid-2010s, thereabout, that hurricane would have been responsible for about 3% of the GDP of the US in terms of damage. So the size of the economy matters. So when you have a small economy, one event can wipe out your entire economy.
So in the climate change space, we often hear about sustainable energy, renewable energy, energy efficiency. If you had to define it in layman's terms, how would you describe sustainable energy?
Yes, well, sustainable energy, the textbook will tell you about practicing to use energy in a way that meets needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So I would say that sustainable energy means that countries ought to be in a position to produce energy in a way in which it's able to meet their, as a minimum, their critical demand. But in a best case scenario, the demand for their economic development, the demand for their social advancement, and the demand for their environmental stewardship. You should be able to produce enough energy to meet those three things and do it in such a way where it is sufficiently resilient to economic shocks and sufficiently resilient also to global climate shock that our countries face. And this will include, hurricanes now. But what you want to do is to really be able to produce energy from systems which allow you to not have to always end up having to have what you want to call it, the predictability rug pulled from under you without you having control over those rugs, as you would have in the situation with oil and gas. Oftentimes when you are importing the energy, you do not have control over those things. So, that in a sense, what sustainable energy is, so you want to do it in such a way that your environmental stewardship is protected. You also want to do it in a way where it's economically valuable to you, so it's cost effective to you, support your economic development. It has to be cost effective and affordable, most importantly. And so we talk about the environmental stewardship. You want to do it in a way where it is relatively clean and friendly to your ecosystems. Not all renewable energy systems are necessarily sustainable, because there are some hydropower systems which are not necessarily ones that I would consider sustainable, because it could disrupt some of your social systems, like displacing populations and killing off large sections of ecosystems. So these things there has to be a judicious balance in looking at what gives you cost-effective value that is affordable to your citizens and give you the kind of reliable access that you need for your environmental and social services, and that doesn't upset the balance of your ecosystems and your environmental situation, and can allow you to be able to meet your demand almost in perpetuity. So it's really a balancing act.
Mm-hmm. And goal 7 of the Sustainable Development Goals speaks to affordable and clean energy, and that is what would really drive our sustainable development.
Certainly. So the point is that if it's not affordable, it's going to do a number of things. If the way you are producing energy is not affordable, and that's not just about producing too, because also the way you use energy sometimes is what makes it not affordable.
Yes.
So it's a balance between production and use. And if it's not affordable, then on the macro level, then it means that you're going to end up investing in a lot of, in the electricity sector in particular, a lot of capacity for generating electricity that you may not necessarily require if you're not using it correctly, which makes it less affordable because then you're paying for more capacity than is necessary to give you the energy services that you desire. So that's why energy efficiency is a critical part of that mix in terms of affordability. We spoke a lot about the affordability on the supply side, but also on the demand side, which is the end use side. The affordability factor is an important one that can be controlled there, because being able to limit and ensure that we use as much of the energy that is produced and transform that into services that are necessary for economic development and social advancement as far as is possible is always going to be critical and important. Otherwise, we will need more energy to do less, and if we use more energy to do less and not extract the maximum value out of the energy that we have, then it means we are going to have to put in more infrastructure, even if it is that is renewable infrastructure and we're not buying fuel. It's still more infrastructure that we'll end up having to pay for to do those services that we could perhaps have done with less energy, and in such instances where we use less energy, it means less infrastructure being able to do the same services, and that would certainly improve the affordability. So that's an important piece of the affordability equation. Over the last 2 decades or so, a lot of it driven by global climate considerations. Technology advancement have been so rapid that we have found that in the last 5 years, solar PV, wind technology is now at parity, and in some instances better, much more cost effective, even than some of the conventional energy sources in terms of the power plants and the cost of fuel. When you look at it over the life cycle, you find that a wind farm or a solar farm that is producing an equivalent amount of electricity oftentimes is now cost competitive with a diesel plant in many of the scales that we use within the Caribbean. And we are finding too in some of other types of technologies, geothermal and so on. It's also becoming cost competitive, not just with diesel but even with natural gas. So there are renewable energy options that are cost competitive with conventional sources, and so there's a lot of pieces related to the logistics chain of the conventional fuels, especially for non-fuel conventional energy producers. The logistics chain and the potential disruptions in the logistics chain, as well as the investments that you have to put in for accommodating the management and the distribution, management, storage and distribution of fuels. These are costs that oftentimes we overlook, and when you put all of these costs into the equations, oftentimes you realize that it's not just about the cost of producing the power, but if you look at the entire value chain from well to your house, or well to plug, if you want to call it that, if it is a house, or your well to wheel if it's a car, you find that the entire value chain of the cost is going to be more expensive for the conventionals than it would be for the renewables. Oftentimes what is happening is that the conventionals are easier to invest in because the plant is usually cheaper. The technology plant is used for converting the fuel to electricity is usually cheaper than it is for the renewable plant.
The upfront investment.
Yeah, exactly. So what you're doing is making a smaller investment right now, but then the fuel costs, which you will have to spend money on over the life of that power plant, is something that over time is significant, and by the time you look at the cost of the plant and the fuel cumulatively compared to say a wind farm or a solar farm, where your investment is pretty much being done up front with the technology with small operating and maintenance costs, you certainly would in the conventional case exceed the life cycle costs in those cases than you would have paid if it was in the case of the renewables. And not all the renewables are equal, because they are not all cheap and they are not all affordable. It all depends on circumstance. Let me put that in there, make that very clear. And there you have to do the judicious assessment to figure out how much it's going to cost you to develop the type of renewable resource that you have available within a specific location. Renewable energy is location specific, and that's one of the challenges too. Diesel plant or diesel use is not typically location specific. You find a piece of land you put in a diesel plant, then the diesel is coming from wherever it is that the suppliers are bringing it from, and you have your storage, which you can put somewhere wherever there's port facilities and so on available. Renewables are a lot more site specific, a lot more fussy in terms of where you can put them. Now, of course, people talk about solar, and the sun is everywhere, and so on. In a sense, yes, but you still have the contention of how much you need and how much land is going to be required and what would have been the best value of that land that you're using. And because it differs from country to country. And that is why there's no silver bullet as to say which renewable energy option and which type of renewable energy plant should be used in a particular situation, but rather that this has to be evaluated on a case-by-case scenario. The economics has to be evaluated, the environmental issues have to be evaluated. But what we need to really do is to look at fair assessments of renewable energy alongside the other energy options, including the natural gas, including the liquid fuels for those who want. In that sense, the natural gas oftentimes may compete and can actually act as a bridging option.
Yes.
That will help you to introduce and integrate your renewables over time. And of course, with the transport realm, we sometimes forget about transport in the context of what we are seeking to do with renewables in electricity. There's a narrowing of there's a great convergence between the electricity sector and the transport sector in terms of the energy requirement for transport, as the technology is now emerging, in the sense that we are now seeing where probably in terms of the projections that are now on the table in another 10 years, there's going to be a seamless integration of transport and electricity, where there's going to be large amounts of electrification within the transport sector, where a significant amount of vehicles are going to be fully electrified, or they are going to be partially electrified as plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, etc., where they can either get power from the grid, 100% power of their power from the grid, or significant amounts of their power from the grid as and when necessary. And then as we go along even further into the next decade, probably in the 2030s, we are looking at the hydrogen economy, where renewable energy-based hydrogen that is being produced from renewable electricity systems, hydrogen produced from renewable electricity systems like geothermal, cheap hydro, being able to produce hydrogen. And that hydrogen being used in fuel cells to run vehicles and run our transport systems is going to be something that will not just be a space era concept, but rather something that will happen, in my view, based on the technology trends, in another decade or so. So, the electricity sector, we focus on it a lot. Recognize that electrification is going to be probably the easiest way of integrating renewable energy into the transport systems and other types of systems. So it's very exciting and interesting to see what is possible.
I know the Caribbean Sustainable Energy Roadmap and Strategy, known as C-SERMS, it set out some ambitious targets for renewable energy efficiency, and greenhouse gas emissions for the region as a whole and also for individual countries. What progress has been made with these targets?
The C-SERMS, which is the Caribbean Sustainable Energy Roadmap and Strategy, was some work undertook in about between 2010 and 2012 by CARICOM as a region to identify how far we could push the envelope in respect to the integration of renewable energy into our electricity systems and what that could potentially look like on a country-by-country basis. And the intention was that would have provided some amount of orientation and guidance to the countries. If we were to be able to figure it out at a regional level, it would have provided some orientation and guidance to countries in terms of how they could, pursue their own national sustainable energy targets and roadmaps and all of that kind of thing. So, in a sense, it was a top-down approach that was utilized, and that initial top-down approach was one that was necessary at the time because the countries, in the majority of cases, lack the experience of sustainable energy capacity in terms of both people and projects. So there was limited experience with implementing sustainable energy projects and limited experience in terms of the officials and technical staff in a lot of the ministries in the countries who had the capability to do some of the sustainable energy work that would have been necessary to map out country targets necessarily. So we thought at the time that doing a top-down approach would have helped to guide and provide orientation to the countries until the countries would have been able to develop the capacity in and of themselves to figure out how they could refine and tweak and manage to provide more realistic national targets and so on. So at the regional level, 2013, the ministers of energy together agreed on this C-SERMS targets, the objectives and strategies of the C-SERMS and the targets. The objectives naturally of the C-SERMS was for there to be integration of renewable energy into the electricity sector, as well as improvements in the energy efficiency and in the energy efficiency mechanisms that we were applying across the sectors, focused mostly on electricity, and to look at the attendant greenhouse gas emissions reductions that would have come with that. And the targets that were set at the time in 2012 when we did the baseline assessment was in 2012. So the targets that were set were relative to 2012. 2012 when we did the baseline assessment, there was around a little under 7% renewable energy in the electricity sector. Most of it was hydro from Belize and Suriname, which were legacy hydro projects, especially the case of Suriname, which was legacy project from the Soralco company. So there wasn't a lot of non-hydro renewables in the system at the time. Small amounts of wind in Jamaica and so on, and very little solar. So there were targets that were set of, at the time, 20% by 2017, because we thought coming from 7% around 2012, we would need to be a little bit modest in terms of what it is we are trying to achieve. So we had set targets of 20% by 2017 because we thought with a lot of the climate action that was resulting, and of course doing the different analysis to look at what were the resources in the countries and how developed were these resources and what kind of funds would be necessary, and with the climate actions that would have been occurring and the expectation that there may have been climate financing available for some of these projects, we thought 20% would have been attainable, and the targets of 20% were set. Of course, as I mentioned, there were a number of scenarios that were analyzed to come up with that 20%, and we did quite a bit of modeling to arrive at that 20%. There was also target of 28% set for 2022. Again, through the two similar models, understanding, of course, where it was that the opportunities would have been coming from in terms of member states and how those opportunities would have been realistically and probabilistically implemented. And then we also agreed to targets of 47% by 2027. So we had three targets: a 2017 target, a 2022 target, and a 2027 target. So it would have been 20%, 28% and 47%, and those are aggregated regional targets for renewable energy, renewable electricity production. Needless to say that there were a number of things that didn't materialize. The CDM, which was a clean development mechanism that was able to drive a lot of the clean energy development around the world, and was helping to finance a lot of the mitigation projects, the climate mitigation projects across the world, especially in the developing states like the Caribbean. Didn't really take off as it was anticipated that it would have, and that in itself robbed the region of a significant amount of cash that people would have thought would have been available to help with some of those projects being developed. That was what our big issue. Climate financing didn't really take off in the region in terms of energy. And even though we are struggling to see how within the GCF climate financing would play a role in in renewable energy implementation. Climate financing so far has really mostly provided small demonstration and pilot projects at the public sector level, but not significant among the private sector level. And so a lot of the renewable energy projects which have been implemented at the regional level so far in countries have been mostly from private equity or private investment spaces without significant amounts of concession. And so without concession, what has happened is that the rate of implementation has been slow because the amount of capital that has always necessary for renewable projects, as we said earlier, is large. Capital outlay for renewable projects is a large amount of money upfront, and it means complex loan negotiations and complex power purchase agreements and complex, different types of complex agreements to go with that complex environmental impact assessments and so on, to ensure that those monies the risks associated with those kind of investments are not too high, because the kind of monies that were available were monies that were available in commercial markets and very risk averse capital. And those risk issues, the region didn't have a lot of experience with renewables. Those risk issues, in my opinion, have limited how much we were able to do. And so, fast forward 2017, we were probably at around 10.3, 10.4% renewable energy, not the 20% that we would have hoped. But at the same time, we had done a lot of work, a lot of soft work. And I say soft work because that's what we typically refer to, that work that doesn't put hardware in the ground as, where we did a lot of work on the policy landscape, a lot of work on the awareness building landscape. We did a lot of work in building capacity and training people. So, so all the countries, for instance, by 2017, every single country in the region either had a policy that was actually, integrated, that sought to integrate renewable energy, or was in an advanced state of developing such a policy. All the countries were, as a minimum, had small pilot demonstrations on renewable energy. There were a significant amount of university degrees. Every country typically had energy units with people who had direct responsibility for renewable energy and so on. So it was a lot that was advanced in terms of the, if you want to call it, the undercurrents. But on the surface, we didn't have the amount of investments that would have led to the large integration of renewable energies that we had expected under the C-SERMS. And we have been doing quite a bit to see how we can aggressively, if you want to call it, push a lot more investments into the next 5 years, which is the 2017 to 2022 period, to see if we can up the ante and catch up even in a significant way with that 28% by 2022. Although, to be honest, one of the things we are also doing is not necessarily to take our foot off the pedal or reduce ambition, but to really also now recognizing that the C-SERMS was developed as a top-down approach, and recognizing that many things would have changed since 2012. We are now looking at doing work in individual countries to now understand from the bottom up what the targets would look like in a realistic way in those countries, and then try to roll up those targets aggregatedly and see what those aggregated targets are going to look like relative to what we had set from the top down, and figure out what would be the best confluence point between the top down targets that were set and the bottom up targets that we are now trying to determine, doing things like integrated resource plans in countries to figure out what are going to be those bottom up targets, and then see how those bottom up targets and top down targets will give us some kind of confluence or agreement in terms of targets. And if there's need for revisions, we will revise. But naturally, one of the things we are hoping is that the bottom-up approach will help us to understand exactly how the contributions to these targets are going to come, and how the investment framework can be supported better by the regional organization and institutions such as the Secretariat, helping to pull the kind of policy piece and the kind of regulatory pieces that are necessary for the investment flows to occur, and entities like the CDB being able to help to leverage its financial credibility to bring investments to bear on many of the projects in the landscape, and institutions like the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, which we have now established, are working very closely with us to do this kind of work.
Yeah, so I know SICRI has been established to really help with the implementation of the roadmap. Despite the challenges that you have outlined in terms of the rate of implementation, there have been some success stories throughout the region as it pertains to renewable energy and energy efficiency. Can you highlight one or two of these projects?
Oh yes, there have been quite a bit of success stories in the region. So we can start with in countries themselves some of the landmark or watershed projects. Let me start, for instance, with the Wigton wind farm in Jamaica, and I start with that because Wigton is a very good case of learning by doing and doing by learning. The first phase of Wigton was completed in 2004, just over 15 years ago, and that that first phase was just over 20 megawatts, and was able to demonstrate, through that first phase of the project that we could successfully put a relatively large for the Caribbean region. That's significant for the Caribbean region. In Europe and the North American landscape, a 20 megawatt project would be viewed as a very small scale project, but in the Caribbean context, that's a big project. And we were able to put down a project like that in Jamaica in 2004. And fast forward to 2020, there have now been a total of 3 phases of that Wigton project in Jamaica. And that is now giving over 60 megawatt of wind cumulatively through those 3 phases of development that have happened in that. That is on the basis of that one project. And there are now other wind farms too in Jamaica, such as the BMR wind farm and so on in St. Elizabeth. That is also added significant amounts of wind. Wind in Jamaica is now, just about 100 megawatts. Then you start looking at solar projects across the region. We have been watching what is happening in the solar markets globally. We have been looking at the lessons in other countries, and of course, looking at opportunities to share information and knowledge and to transfer technology. And so there is pretty much every single country in the Caribbean. Trinidad perhaps is now one of those who are on the cusp of joining that list. Every single country in the CARICOM region has a significant solar project implemented. As I said, the size varies from country to country. Most of them are substantial compared to the size of the grids that they operate. You're talking about countries like St. Lucia with 3 megawatt solar systems in our grid, which is 60 megawatts. You're talking about countries like St. Kitts that are ambitiously pushing to put in 30 megawatts of solar PV with battery storage in a country that has a grid of around 50 megawatts. As an example, you're talking about Suriname, which is running a gold mine, an entire gold mine of a 10 megawatt solar PV system, as you have in the Iron Gold facility there. And you have Gardner, which is talking about 35 megawatts of renewable solar PV and battery storage coming up very soon. Even the CARICOM Secretariat itself, our headquarters building, had it not been for the coronavirus pandemic, by September this year, we would have been completely running on solar PV and battery, because we have a 400 kilowatt system that we were in the middle of installing when the coronavirus pandemic broke out, and we have suspended the works and will resume as soon as the restrictions have been lifted. Just as some basic examples, just to show that the technology, the amount of understanding and the amount of, if you want to call it, the acceptance of the technology has increased significantly. And many of the countries have put in the policy measures and mechanisms for these technologies to be integrated. And so there's been a lot of integration of wind and solar technology as a minimum in a significant number of countries within the region. And there are also other types of projects too. We are talking about in the context of the Eastern Caribbean. All the Eastern Caribbean countries, with the exception of Antigua and Barbuda, are actively pursuing geothermal programs, serious geothermal programs. They are all at different stages, but they have recognized that they have a geothermal capacity that they need to look at, and they have been actively pursuing those. Dominica has already proven its resources and is actively trying to tie up the last pieces that are necessary for a 7 megawatt system to be built in that country. St. Lucia is still actively pursuing its opportunities. St. Vincent has been doing a lot of work. Grenada is doing a lot of work. Montserrat has been doing a lot of work. So they are all looking at geothermal as option, the opportunities and options for integrating geothermal into their electricity systems. Then you have countries like Ghana who have been looking at hydro, both small scale and large scale hydro. So, Suriname have been looking to rehabilitate some of its hydro systems, aspects of its hydro system that it has there, while it integrates solar PV. Hydro has also come up in Belize to where they are looking to rehabilitate some of their hydro systems to expand the capacities there. So there are all different options that are being considered, and interestingly, countries are now moving, just not talking about onshore renewable energy options, but we are now talking about marine renewable energy options and opportunities too, recognizing that there are limits to land-based systems. As I mentioned earlier, in many instances you don't have the size tracts of lands that are necessary to give you cost competitive wind farms or solar farms. So countries are now looking at opportunities for offshore wind. I know Jamaica is actively looking at offshore wind. So is Barbados, so is Belize, so is Ghana and Suriname. And people say, but why is Ghana and Suriname looking at offshore wind when they have all that land? Because they don't want to clear pristine forests to put up wind farms, number one. And number two, if most of those countries that are in these large continental shelves, the population centers where most of the demand is at the coast. So because of how sensitive wind energy is to location, you don't want to find that you have your location where you can get a good wind regime 300 miles, 400 miles away from your city, and then you have to build a very lengthy transmission network to bring the wind from locations where it's not readily available. In those instances where land is available in the country, because of the way things are set up, those are things that are being looked at. Of course, I think the most significant thing that has happened in the region over the last couple of years is now the understanding that energy is, on the one hand, it's not an end in of itself. Energy is really not something that you just simply do to serve as an end product, but rather energy is a means to an end. We have all the countries are now, in a sense where they are baptized to the fact that energy is a means to an end, and that end is holistic sustainable development. And the energy projects in the majority of countries are always being looked at through sustainable development lens, and that is a huge difference from how energy was treated in the past, where we simply try to project what the demand would have been, and we simply build more supply to meet the demand, and that was it. Now we are looking at how is it that we can manage the demand in such a way that we reduce the rate of growth of demand, so that we can spend less on the supply expansions to meet the demand that is necessary for us to provide the services. So we are no longer just looking at the demand, but looking at the services that we want to provide and see whether that demand is actually necessary for us to provide these services, and where we don't need all that demand to produce the services. We sometimes find ways and means, including technology means, sometimes behavior means, to reduce that demand and are able to meet the same services. And so that holistic look at energy is something that is been a major, if you want to call it, advancement over the last decade within the Caribbean region, where people are now treating energy efficiency as a resource, not just as something that you do after the fact, but it's really part of the planning cycle. When you are thinking of energy expansion, is now mainstream. No one thinks about renewable energy anymore as pilots, but rather renewable energies are being considered and judiciously assessed in scenarios alongside other options, as we are looking at our different plant retirement cycles and our different expansion planning schedules as we go along. The critical piece too, which is for me again also very important, is the role of resilience that we have now built into the energy system, where we have recognized as a region that there is need for energy resilience in our systems. And when I say energy resilience, in a way in which it is two-way flow of resilience, that wherein the energy systems are on the one hand more resilient to the potential impacts and effects of climate change that we expect to come based on the projections, like temperature changes. We want to put in energy systems that are able to adapt to the sensitivities of temperature change, which we know are occurring because of climate change. Systems that are able to, even if they can't withstand completely, but they will be able to shut down and restart as soon as there is a hydrometeorological event such as a hurricane that would have passed. So them and all of these kind of things. So we are looking to see how we can improve the resilience of the energy systems where you no longer look at one power plant by itself, but look at the totality of the system and see what happens if I lose this hydro here because of a drought and I can no longer produce hydropower from this plant. Will I have something else to compensate from somewhere else? How do I diversify to ensure that I do not end up depending on one option? And that's one of the issues too, which we are using to ensure that we reduce systematically the amount of oil based power plants in our system, because it's also an issue that affects the level of flexibility and the level of diversity that we have in our energy system. So if there's a blockade, for instance, because of something that would have happened somewhere, or a supply disruption because of a storm in the Gulf of Mexico, or something that disrupts the port of Miami and reduces the port of Louisiana, like hurricanes up that side too, and reduces the ability of ships to sail or tankers to sail with refined petroleum products. We no longer are at lost by those situations and those issues, and have to depend only on what we have in store, because we will be able to produce some of the energy, if not all, in some instances, from indigenous sources that do not require fuel. So if the issue of diversification is an important one to the resilience. So we are looking at how it is that the energy system can be more resilient through diversification and through hardening of the infrastructure. Diversification to give us greater flexibility in terms of how we design the system, not just on the supply side, but also in terms of how we deliver the energy through the grid. Looking at different grid designs that can give us more diversity and flexibility in how the grid is designed, and of course looking at how we can also diversify on the demand side, on the end use side, including giving local generation capabilities to some buildings, such as rooftop solar and battery and small wind turbines in some facilities, small efficient cogeneration systems in certain types of facilities, and so on. So it's really a matter of a holistic approach that is being taken, and critically too, as I mentioned, the resilience. So this, looking at how we can do that on the end user side, is also using energy as a resilience tool for these end users. So if you think about a hospital or a school that now has is able to produce local amounts of energy from sources that are embedded within those buildings, it means that they do not have to depend on the grid in order to produce a certain energy for their critical needs. A hospital, for instance, that have some amount of solar and battery and maybe a cogeneration unit, as an example. If the grid is down, they no longer have to worry about running a backup generator and still having to find a way to get the fuel from wherever it can be sourced, sometimes at 5 and 6 times the price of what is the market price, so that they can run a backup generator and making a lot of noise and requiring a lot of maintenance and servicing. They will be able to produce from clean, renewable sources and efficient, modern sources of energy. Energy to run as a minimum their critical facilities, the ICU units, there's sterile zones so that they can sanitize and sterilize whatever equipment is needed, the lighting requirements and other things that are necessary for them to at least operate in a way that is efficient and allow them to do what they were supposed to do in the first place.
So, Dr. Gardner, like climate change, COVID-19 has been a great disruptor, and no one is immune. So, as we anticipate the new normal, what is your post-COVID-19 outlook?
Yes, thanks for that. Well, interesting, because it's funny you would mention that, because when we were planning the resilient features in the energy sector in a recent meeting, I think, 2 years ago, when we started thinking about how are we going to integrate in a systematic way climate issues into energy planning, we started thinking about also public health. Why? Because of the experience of chikungunya. Because I remember one of the guys in the room said, Devon, one of the challenges we had and faced as a utility was when we had the chikungunya outbreak in Jamaica at the time, half of the people couldn't turn up to work. Meaning half of the engineers who were supposed to be running the power plants couldn't turn up to work, and we were struggling. People had to be running 2 shifts and operating in environments which you would consider to be not your best practice because of those things. How do we take into consideration that? And interestingly, we were able to link that back to the climate because at the time, chikungunya, which is based on a vector carrier, which is mosquito, is understood to be a climate-related, public health issue because mosquitoes tend to thrive under certain conditions, and there's a view that the climate change do impact, the efficiency of some vectors like mosquitoes and so on. So we were asked to consider in that instance, climate-related public health issues and how that could impact. And so we were already thinking about public health, but mostly those that would relate to things like dengue and chikungunya and those kind of vectors that we think could have been climate-related. And then but in this field clients, the same issues would also apply. The COVID issue. What is going to happen if it is that you were to lose significant numbers of your workforce because they were to be sick and so on. So it was interesting when those things come up. But not to skirt the question, to go to the jugular of what you have asked in terms of the post-COVID analysis.
Mm-hmm.
We have seen a number of things that has happened. We have seen where, on the one hand, there have been a significant reduction in the demand of electricity, for instance, from the electricity system. We shut down our centers of commerce and industry because of the social and physical distancing requirements on the one hand, but also because of the lack of demand on the other. Imagine you're running a hotel and there are no passengers to come because of flight and traveling restrictions all around. Then even if you could put measures in for social and physical distancing in your hotel, there's no demand. If you are producing, for instance, cars, if you're selling cars as an example, you have a commercial office that is giving out providing certain services, and those services are no longer in high demand during this period because that's not something that people are viewing as critical. Then those services are no longer required, and those industries are going to take a beating. And so what they typically do is either reduce significantly their activities or they shut it down completely. So commercial demand dropped across the region. Industrial demand dropped across the region. Residential demand, of course, increased. But typically, the energy intensity in your commercial and your industrial customers are much higher than your residential customers. So what you end up with was an overall drop. So as a first, in the short term, what it means is that utilities would have lost revenue that they had projected for based on the natural progression of demand that they would have used in their different calculations. So, utilities usually would have done demand projections, and in doing those demand analysis, certain economic growth rates and certain factors would have been used. And so, when these unforeseen circumstances would not have been captured in those forecasts, and there is now that demand erosion that would have taken place. That means there is a certain amount of revenue loss that would have resulted. And so, as a case in point, utilities, therefore, that are expected to provide certain investments in the system in order to accommodate renewables. For instance, when we're talking about variable renewables like wind and solar, utilities need to put in certain types of investments to accommodate for the variability in the energy that is produced by these systems because of the daily variability of the resource. Wind go up and down, sun goes up and down because if the cloud comes, the cloud covers the sun, and it therefore is not available to produce energy as it would before. If the cloud passes, then the production of energy jumps back up to almost peak capacity again. So those variabilities in how the solar systems and wind systems produce energy on a daily basis have to be managed by feeding it into the grid in a certain way and putting certain technologies on the grid to help to regulate the frequency and the voltage that are naturally going to be, which need to be at a certain value, but will be impacted, of course, by the variability in the wind and the solar PV in that sense. So there are going to be issues related to the ability of utilities to be able to make these investments at the time that they were supposed to make these investments. And so the question is going to be, if the utilities are unable to make the investments in some of the grid modernizations or grid upgrades that are necessary for certain types of renewable projects to come onto the grid at the schedule that they were before, what will happen? Is it that somebody else will have to pay a fee and then will this find its way into the rate? So those are some of the things that we have to look at. Also, we have to look at see what is the rate at which the demand goes back up, because when the restrictions have been lifted, it's not going to be that you start you go right back into 100% productivity
from 0 to 100.
Exactly, we're not going to go from 0 to 100, so we are going to have to look to see what is the rate at which we are going to return to that new normal and understand what that would mean in terms of the demand building up of that demand erosion that happened in the first place, and then the new demand that was supposed to have been coming additional to the pre-existing to the demand that was pre-COVID. And I therefore foresee that there will be a reduction in a rate of demand growth. And any rate of demand growth reduction is going to mean a delay in the expansion requirements for new plants. So if you are projected that you may need new plants in 3 years from now, let's say you said you wanted to have another 50 megawatts of capacity in a country A within another 3 years because of a projected growth rate, such as Ghana, which had a certain projected growth rate because of the oil boom which was foreseen. And now with the COVID-19, that kind of remains static, at least in terms of some of the economics that are supposed to have happened. Businesses that would have been built, weren't built, or will not be built in the time in which they would have been built. The economics activities that would have been happening are now going to resume at a slower rate of pace than they would have been happening otherwise. And so that could lead to a delay in the investment in new plants. So plants which should have been built in 3 years will probably end up being built in 5 years, in 6 years. So your renewable energies will come, but they will come at a slower rate than they would have been coming before. So we have to be careful, for instance, as an example, as I said to some of my colleagues, when we go to the COP, we have to make sure that we understand what we are doing in terms of the NDCs, because at the end of the day, a lot of what we may have been looking at in terms of the NDCs, in terms of new renewable energy projects coming into the system within a certain time frame, which is the time frame next 5 years, because the revisions are every 5 years. Some of those projects which we expected to come on stream within the next 5 years are not going to come until after the next 5 years. So we have to revise our targets because that is going to be something that will be affected. We are going to end up in a situation where there will be delays in the implementation of new projects, both in terms of new infrastructure projects. The delay in new infrastructure projects will mean lower demand growth, as well as the fact that the economy itself is going to be gradually building back up to where it was pre-COVID, and then of course having to surpass pre-COVID to get back to its growth trajectory. That is going to take quite a bit of time. As one economist, in fact, Paul Krugman was being interviewed this morning at Bloomberg, and he said, the economic growth that we see coming back after COVID is going to look more like a Nike swoosh rather than the V that everybody's predicted. We're not going to be going back up at the same rate at which we declined. It's going to be a long, painful, slow process to get it back to where it was before, and that is going to lead to delays in the rate of implementation of renewable energy projects. It could also affect the rate at which energy efficiency projects are implemented too, because there will be a competition for capital with lower economic growth. And the fact is, when there is a competition for capital, if there's not enough money to be spent on all things, the public health sector obviously is going to be one which is going to be treated as priority now, given the experiences of COVID-19. Yes. And therefore, monies that may have been otherwise spent on energy efficiency and programs, especially public programs for energy efficiency and so on, might not find itself there. On the private sector side, businesses that would have lost money because of the shutdown and the whole situation may find that they do not have the money to invest in their own private upgrades and they were planning to do in their own facilities. People who would have been laid off from work and therefore would have lost income may not have the money to put in a solar PV system on the roof or to invest in some amount of energy efficiency interventions, or maybe not even have the ability to even take out a loan anymore if you have lost a job and no longer are working. Both at the macro level, at the micro level, supply side, demand side, there will be a slowing of the the implementation of projects. But the expectation is that it is an opportunity.
Of course, every crisis.
To ensure it's an opportunity for us to ensure that as we build out the system, the economic systems, we build them back better and build them in such a way that we deepen the integration of sustainable energy measures in those systems so that they are ramped up in a more modern and efficient way than they were before the crisis took over. It's really a matter of trying to manage that reduction in demand growth which we expect, and in such a way trying to ensure that we do not end up losing too much focus on the fact that these renewable projects should be built anyway, even if it is that we no longer build them in 3 years, we build them in 5 years. Okay, we understand that is the case, so we'll have to ensure that we keep focus on the types of projects that we were planning to build anyway and simply take the most expeditious route out. But we recognize that there will be delays in when these projects are going to be invested and investments are going to come online, both on the supply side and on the demand side, from renewable energy to energy efficiency.
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Gardner, the importance of sustainable energy is clear. I mean, for us as small island developing states, as you mentioned, it's a matter of survival, it's a matter of energy security, and also adapting to climate change. Although we anticipate a slowed rate of implementation, we still look forward to seeing the soft work that you spoke about in terms of policy and capacity building, seeing that materialize into actual renewable energy power generation capacity throughout the region. I know we have only scratched the surface as it relates to the sustainable energy transition in the region, and perhaps I can have you back on the podcast so we can further the conversation. But
yes, certainly.
So, any closing remarks, Dr. Gardner?
As small island developing states, the key for us is to recognize that our systems are unique, and what they need are tailor-made solutions that fit our circumstances. And the realities of small island developing states are ones that should recognize that on the one hand, we do not have the luxuries of interconnected systems that a lot of other regions have. That's one of the things, and therefore our systems are always going to be more expensive than the typical system elsewhere. So the ability of us to integrate renewable energy system in the conventional sense and get the best price mix as some countries like Germany and Canada and the US would do is always going to require more judicious analysis, more painstaking understanding than it would in many of these countries where large renewable energy systems are simply, if you want to call it, a small proportion of the total system that they have. That is why it's important for us to never just simply accept and put systems that are in other countries carte blanche into the Caribbean as is, but to understand exactly how we can transfer the technology best to make them work for us in the way in which they are optimized. It is going to be important for us to pay attention to the ocean, because that is going to be that is where we have the majority of our resources available. Things like wind renewable energy, things like ocean thermal energy, things like seawater air conditioning. We have, as I said, we have been able to scratch the surface in a lot of the newer technologies and options that are available. But it's time we start thinking about those options and not just think about the conventional renewable energy options in this sense, because nobody's going to think about those novel principles and applications for us, because in many instances, they are applicable only to us in the tropics in the Caribbean. So, my bottom line is, let's be innovative, let's be creative, and let's think of what works best for us, and let's find ways and means through which we can more deeply integrate energy and climate with agriculture, with water, with all the other productive sectors that we have in the region, and create a symbiotic process of economic development and social advancement. Thanks very much.
I wish to thank you so much, Dr. Gardner, for chatting with me today about your work towards the sustainable and secure energy systems in the Caribbean region. Where can listeners connect with you and the CARICOM Energy Unit?
Yes, certainly listeners can feel free to connect with either me directly or with the CARICOM Energy Unit in general. There's a CARICOM Energy website, which is energy.caricom.org. So if you go to the CARICOM Energy website, you'll find quite a bit of information there. You'll see a lot of the work we are doing. You will be able to sign up to receive any information that we post from time to time, and you'll be able to send queries or ask information. Otherwise, people can reach out directly to me at devon.gardner@caricom.org. So it's devon.gardner@caricom.org. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gardner. So if you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review and share the podcast with your friends and family. Join the movement by following us on Facebook and Instagram at The Climate Conscious. Thank you for listening. Bye.